Over the last few races, we've started to see a change in fortunes for drivers that have moved teams over the winter. After a tough start to the season for nearly all of these drivers, the majority have started to find their feet at their new teams. But why has it taken so long for the transferred drivers to get up to speed in 2021? Let's have a look. My name's Andy and this is Behind the Drive. A theme of this season so far has been the fact that the drivers that made moves to new teams this year have taken a while to get up to speed and compete with their new teammates. The key drivers that moved teams this year are Sergio Perez, Carlos Sainz, Daniel Ricciardo, Sebastian Vettel and Fernando Alonso, and they've had varying degrees of success at this stage in the season. In this video I'll compare these 5 drivers and look at some of the factors that's meant that they took a while to get up to speed. And as always, thank you for continuing to hit the like and subscribe button as it massively supports the channel. Their teammates. The first point to look at is the fact that for all of the drivers that I've mentioned, they've partnered a new teammate with at least 1 year of experience with that team. And not only do they have the experience of that team environment, but they've actually been driving near enough these same cars that they had last year. This year, the cars were evolutions of last year's challenges. This means that the drivers have had a season's worth of experience driving those cars, and given they haven't developed too much, the drivers staying at the same teams would always be at a significant advantage over their new teammates. This is different to normal times where a car tends to be a new version each year, and yes, there would be similarities from one season to another, but they would be fundamentally new designs that may take some time to get used to. As a result, the advantage falls to the driver with that experience, whilst the new driver would need to take time to learn how things work at the new constructor as well as with their new car. A great example of a teammate being faster has been with Daniel Ricciardo and Lando Norris. The amount of time that it's taken the Australian driver to get towards his potential has been significant, particularly when compared with his less experienced teammate Lando Norris. And it's emerged through this year that the McLaren car is actually quite a challenge to get to grips with, something that both Norris and Sainz masked well throughout last year as they achieved 3rd in the Constructors' Championship. But, as a new joiner to the team, Ricciardo struggled with his new car and how to get the most out of it. Even Carlos Sainz sent Ricciardo a text to ask him about how he was getting on and how challenging that car is to drive. So not only did Ricciardo need to develop a relationship with the team, and in particular his race engineer, but he also needs to get to grips with the car itself. Whereas Lando Norris has been able to get the most out of that McLaren car from the get-go, which has allowed him to take 2 podium finishes and have double the number of points of his new teammate at the time of recording. There are signs of this changing, as you'd expect from a driver of Ricciardo's calibre, as he was closer to the British driver's pace in France and in Spain. But despite this, he still remained behind Norris in both qualifying and the race in France, with the McLaren drivers coming home in 5th and 6th respectively. But nonetheless, there were signs that Ricciardo was finding his feet in his new car. It shows how experience in the team and the car has put Ricciardo at a disadvantage this year, and that, in turn, has put a question mark over his reputation in the sport. Looking at the Styrian Grand Prix, Ricciardo struggled once again, only achieving 13th in qualifying, and then finishing in the same spot in that race. He did well in the early stages, but was let down by a power unit issue, which dropped him back down the order. It was a shame to see, but it's worth noting that he was out of position in the first place, which was preventing him from unlocking the full potential of his car, which his teammate managed as he came home in 5th. So once again, the teammates do have an advantage, although how long that advantage should last is debatable once the transferred drivers get comfortable in their new team environments. Testing time. The next point to look at is the fact that this season there's been a significantly reduced testing schedule compared to previous years. The pre-season testing dropped from 6 days in 2020 to just 3 days in 2021. There's also been a change to the race weekend schedule, with FP1 and FP2 sessions reduced to an hour from 90 minutes. In terms of the pre-season testing time, this was decided as a result of the fact that the teams would be running similar cars to last season, with the 2020 chassis transferred across to the 2021 cars. But it was probably also decided with the new mandated budget cap in mind, given the teams are restricted on their spending this year for the first time. This, again, puts the transferred drivers at a disadvantage compared to their teammates. Testing, for the teams in particular, is a crucial time to establish where they're at with the cars, but it's also important for the drivers as they start to identify the setups that they might want to favour for the year, and also in terms of identifying key development areas that they'd want to direct the team towards. By restricting each driver to a maximum of 1.5 days running, it leaves them with less time than they would do when jumping into a new Formula car in the past, and it also left them at risk if they suffered with any reliability issues, which one of the transferred drivers in particular, Sebastian Vettel, ended up facing in his new Aston Martin car. It was a tough testing schedule for Aston Martin entirely, and Sebastian Vettel in particular, as he achieved just 117 laps in testing, with the team overall turning 314 laps across the 3 days, the second fewest of any team. Throughout the testing, the team suffered issues with their gearbox, a turbo issue, and an electronics failure, and these issues definitely affected Vettel's running more than Stroll's. And when you consider the fact that Pierre Gasly managed 237 laps over the testing schedule, you realise that the French driver had managed to complete roughly 2 Grand Prix distances more than the German driver through the testing period. It's this stark difference which might not be too noticeable at the time, but looking back it's quite clear that some drivers were put on the front foot more than the others. On the other hand, there are some teams and drivers that have an inherent advantage in this department. Take, for example, another of the transferred drivers, Carlos Sainz, who was able to do some testing in an old Ferrari car after joining the team at the start of the year. His first testing came in a 2018 Ferrari car at Fiorano, where he managed to complete over 100 laps. He completed this running all the way back in January, a long way before the start of the 2021 testing, and I expect it gave him the chance to work with his new engineers and get to grips with one of the ancestors of his 2021 car. Yes, it wasn't the brand new car that he'd be racing, but it was better than nothing, and would have given him at least some advantage over his rivals. You then have the practice time at each of the races, and this season both FP1 and FP2 have been shortened by half an hour each. This may not seem like much, but certainly early on in the season, when you have the likes of Sebastian Vettel well behind in terms of the amount of mileage he's completed, even 60 minutes of running lost at each race can add up. This means that again, the drivers that are already familiar with the teams will have a distinct advantage over their new teammates, and they will therefore have more reference points from previous races, or perhaps they may have a better idea of how their car could behave on the tyres during each race. This idea of there being less testing this year will have had a cumulative effect across the season. I'd expect that the transferred drivers will have noticed that change more than the drivers that stayed put going into this year. And in a sport where every team and driver is hunting for marginal gains, these kind of adaptations on a race weekend will make a significant difference overall. Getting up to speed requires adaptation. The final point to discuss on this topic is the fact that getting up to speed takes time and requires adaptation from where they may have been with their previous car. It's impossible for a new car, particularly this far into a set of aerodynamic regulations, to be totally suited to a driver's preferred driving style. There will have been years of development that will have taken teams down a path to get to where they are now. And if a driver goes in and tries to adapt everything with the car to suit their own style, then they could find themselves chasing a desired feeling that will never arrive. This was one of the criticisms of Pierre Gasly when he moved to Red Bull in 2019. He would get right into the detail of the data and make tweaks to suit his driving style, but he would fundamentally never find the sweet spot. And this is something that Sergio Perez, on the other hand, avoided since joining the Red Bull team. Perez has adapted well to his new car and the team around him, despite his predecessors failing to do so in the same environment. He's also taken the time to learn as much as possible from Alex Albon, the driver in that car last year, and that extra data and information will have undoubtedly improved his chances in that Red Bull car. And a key difference between Perez and Gasly or Albon is the fact that he has experience with driving multiple different Formula 1 cars already, and he knows how to extract performance from them when they're not quite where the team expected them to be. So when a driver changes team, they won't be fully aware of what they need to change or work on until they can actually drive the new car. The more experienced drivers tend to adapt their driving style to fit the needs of the car, whereas less experienced drivers tend to try and adapt the car to suit them. Of course, these are all sweeping statements, but these things could be factors as to why it's been a theme of 2021, with the transferred drivers ending up behind the drivers that have remained with their teams on average. It's also worth noting that the driver that's probably adapted the fastest of all of the transfer drivers is Carlos Sainz. I've already discussed the fact that he had an opportunity to test a previous version of his Ferrari car, but he's also made significant life changes with his move to Ferrari. After moving to Woking when driving for McLaren, the Spaniard has moved once again to Italy, near the Ferrari factory at Maranello. It's a huge life decision, and something that not many other drivers do to the same extent. This move's allowed him to connect with the engineers and spend a lot more time at the factory working with his colleagues. This is a crucial element to switching teams that's frequently overlooked, and is probably one of the main reasons that Sainz is the exception to the rule this season, and has actually been on the pace of Charles Leclerc in a Ferrari car that certainly last season looked to be a handful in the hands of Sebastian Vettel. So to get up to speed, a driver needs to adapt and make changes that often take time. But as we've seen from the points I've looked at in this video, there are ways to potentially speed up the process. It's important to note that this is never a one-size-fits-all, and it will always take time for a driver to find their feet when in a new environment. It's also worth noting that given so many drivers have made the change this year and moved teams, there was and is always going to be comparisons made between them and their respective teammates, whereas it wouldn't be so obvious if just one or two drivers had made the switch. Why do you think the drivers have taken a while to get up to speed in their new cars? Let me know in the comments, and if you enjoyed the video and watched to this point, then please hit the like button and subscribe for more videos throughout the 2021 season.